So thanks to everyone who's joining in. Um, Based on feedback we received at our last Do More Good dialogue, affordable housing is a topic that's top of mind. And so we're really thrilled to be joined with a fantastic panel today to go through some key pieces that are happening right now in Waterloo Region with regards to affordable housing. For those just joining us, we are going to be recording this webinar and circulating it next week for those who missed something or want to review the content or share it with family and friends. So thank you again to everyone who could join us today. If you have any questions on the content being shared, please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Just hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen and you'll find the Q&A button. If you've joined us by phone and you would like to ask a question, please wait until the Q&A portion and you can ask your question at that time. So let's get started. First off, we respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. We are currently situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. In a moment, I'll be turning the podium, so to speak, over to Brock Hart, the Board Chair of Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation's Board of Directors. Brock will briefly speak about KWCF and affordable housing before introducing our 3 speakers from various organizations in Waterloo Region. And finally, as I mentioned, there will be a panel conversation and at the end where we'll also be answering your questions live. I'd now like to introduce Brock Hart. Brock is a serial entrepreneur focused on helping organizations embrace innovation through design. He is a former creative director and award-winning designer with an undergraduate degree in sociology and a diploma in design. He is passionate about the power of human-centered design to make things better. Asking the question why is always his starting point. And he is a trusted advisor to organizations and leaders who are ready to radically change in order to achieve true transformation. Adept at bringing people together around big ideas, Brock is a visionary thinker and an extraordinary facilitator. Brock, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today as we discuss this very important topic. We're joined today by 3 amazing leaders from our community. Dr. Martine August is the assistant professor at the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. Ryan Pettipiere is Director of Housing Services at the Region of Waterloo, who is also a member of our new Housing Innovation Roundtable. And John Neufeld is the Executive Director of the House of Friendship. I'll be, when I introduce them before they speak, I'll read more of a bio for each of them for those that are interested. We're focusing this Do More Good dialogue on affordable housing because it was an area of interest from participants who attended our past sessions. And it's also a key priority area of the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation. Today, we'll discuss affordable housing in Waterloo Region in the context of COVID-19, and topics will include how our community has responded to COVID-19 for our homeless population and those in affordable housing. Second, how we think about housing across Waterloo Region and the supports required for everyone to have a place to call home. And third, the ways to build upon what we've learned and not lose momentum to make a lasting positive impact. It is also extremely important to mention the Black Lives Matter movement and share one small step we're taking at the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation. Next week, we're convening a conversation with the African Caribbean Black Network on Thursday, June 25th at 2 p.m., where we'll be discussing a number of key issues as well as affordable housing. And we'll be sending out more details on that very soon. We really do hope that we can have the same kind of attendance at that critical conversation as we do today. In the meantime, let's get started with today's conversation. Each of the panelists is going to make some brief comments, and then I'll moderate a conversation with all of them based on questions that have come in from you folks, either live today and or ones that were sent in ahead of time. So Martine, let's begin with you. Martine August is an assistant professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on housing and urban social justice, including themes related to gentrification, displacement, community organizing, urban redevelopment, financialization, and the politics of social mix. She formerly worked as a housing policy advisor in the Ontario Public Service. Martine, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for that introduction. I can see I'm wearing the same shirt in this picture, but have the longer COVID hair. I want to begin by thanking the Community Foundation for organizing this event and for inviting me to take part in it. Affordable housing is such a huge issue. So for today's talk and my comments, I'm just going to discuss a few themes related to affordable housing. And I'm going to focus on rental housing. Homeownership, I know, is also a big issue in the region, and a lot of people can't afford to buy homes, but rental housing is really where you find the greater concentration of affordability issues. So you have more lower income people living in rental housing, also more disadvantaged households, and more affordability problems. So in Canada, about 40% of renters are experiencing problems with affordability. So I want to start by describing a trend that's affecting rental housing that I study, which is the financialization of housing. And this is a trend in which you have old apartment buildings, sometimes that are providing low-cost rental housing, that are being bought up and acquired by large finance-backed corporate landlords. So in Canada, over the past 2 decades, these types of firms, real estate investment trusts, private equity, have bought up about 20% of the private rental housing in the country. These are huge corporate landlords. They manage the buildings on behalf of investors, and their priority really is to drive more value and profit for investors. So for tenants, what this means is more rent increases and often displacement. Because really for these firms, they have a business model which is based on squeezing tenants, trying to extract more from those buildings. And they do this by raising rents, as I mentioned, or replacing existing tenants with somebody that can afford to pay more, which is why I say they use a business strategy that's based on displacement. So in the region, there are firms like Starlight Investments or Northview Real Estate Investment Trust, among other firms that are active in this kind of consolidation of multifamily housing, which is putting pressure on households. And this isn't just in rental housing, conventional rental housing, but also in student housing, you see these trends, and in seniors housing as well. So that's one trend that's been driving affordability problems, but it's not the only one. We've also had decades of disinvestment in social and affordable housing by governments. We've seen rising inequality, which is exacerbating these trends. Also, the rise of the short-term rental market. Airbnb has taken a lot of affordable housing off the market, although this has been also affected by COVID-19. So speaking of how COVID-19 has influenced these issues, one of the major impacts of the pandemic is that it's been leading to economic hardship for many people. You have a lot of households that can't pay their rent during this time. So during the pandemic, we've had in the province of Ontario an eviction ban. Landlords cannot evict tenants during the pandemic. But my concern, and I think the concern of a lot of others, is what is going to happen when this eviction ban is lifted. There's actually no rent relief planned by governments for tenants. The provincial government in Ontario is pushing through legislation that's actually going to make evictions easier. And what my concern is that the process to sort of deliver on all the pent-up landlord demand to push people out of their homes is going to lead to a bit of a crisis after the pandemic. We're going to see potentially a rise in displacement, homelessness, and hardship for lower income people who have been affected by COVID-19. The final point I want to make just during these brief comments is that we know who's most harmed by these trends. Racialized people, Black and Indigenous people of color are overrepresented among renter households. This is who's being hardest hit by these affordability issues. Also women, single parent households, people with disabilities, and newcomer households. It's also who we're seeing in more service jobs and in the communities that are hardest hit by the COVID-19 virus. So we're seeing higher infection rates and mortality rates. Affordable housing is one important piece of the puzzle in trying to create more equitable communities, particularly in this moment when activists are drawing renewed attention to racial inequality in our society. So I'll just finish with one final point, which is how do you get resources to expand affordable housing, which is so clearly an important part of the solution. I think it's important to listen to the calls that are being made by a lot of activists and writers in the Black Lives Matter movement, also being made locally by the African, Caribbean, and Black Network of Waterloo Region, who we'll hear from next week. But the demand I'm hearing is to defund police and redistribute these resources to things that would help communities. So what we want to do is dismantle institutions that systemically perpetuate violence against Black and Indigenous people in our communities, and then use those precious resources to support positive interventions. by funding things like education, healthcare, income supports, and also, importantly, affordable housing. Thanks.
It's great. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Martine. I would now like to introduce Ryan to speak. Ryan attended Wilfrid Laurier University and completed a BA in psychology. After teaching English for 2 years in Thailand, Ryan joined the County of Wellington, where he worked for 13 years in Wellington's Social Services Division, progressing to Director of Housing there in 2016. In 2019, Ryan joined the region of Waterloo as Director of Housing, where he oversees the region's housing and homelessness portfolio. Ryan lives in Arkell, Ontario, just outside of Guelph, with his wife and 2 young boys. Ryan, please take it away.
Thanks for that, Brock. Appreciate the opportunity to be on today's panel and to speak about affordable housing. So my thanks to you and the KW Community Foundation. For my comments, I think what I want to say is that for those working in the housing and homelessness sector, the magnitude of the issue and the challenges, they've always been readily apparent. What's changed significantly over the last few years, though, is that interest in that apparentness has expanded to other sectors, whether that's economic development, planning, politicians, academics, et cetera. And really what it's also done is it's also expanded across all of the income spectrum. Housing affordability isn't just a low income issue. It touches and affects individuals no matter where you sit on that income continuum. Whether that affects you directly on this call, someone in your family, or a neighbor. I would put forward that there's not really anybody around in our community that isn't touched by housing affordability at this point in time. Wanting to speak a little bit about the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in and have been through the pandemic lens. And if you entertain me to start with a premise, and that premise being that a community is only as strong and as successful as the most vulnerable of their residents. That I would put forward that over the last few years, we as a region, we as a province, frankly, as a country, we've been struggling. We're not winning. And what I think has become more clear through the lens of the pandemic is that the importance of the housing and the emergency shelter sectors and those capacities are critical for the overall well-being of our region. What we have seen is that while services and agencies and the businesses around us have continued to shut down through the pandemic, the areas of housing and homelessness have had to continue to ramp up exponentially to fill that gap and also to ensure the safety of the most vulnerable residents in our community. And if we didn't have that ability to rally together as a community, as a system, if we didn't have the ability to access additional provincial and federal funding in a hurry to support those services put into place in our community, then not only would that vulnerable population be put at additional risk, but so too the broader community overall. And what I hope that through this is that the higher orders of government have been paying attention and not only to the great work that we have done to protect our community across the region, but that significant levels of funding is necessary to continue to support those efforts in the future. We've learned a whole lot through this pandemic, and we know that fundamentally to ensure the health, the safety, the continued success of Waterloo Region, it's critical that the social safety net and most importantly, housing as a foundational piece of all of that work continues to be a critical piece of that equation overall. Thanks, Brock.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing those thoughts. Before we move on to John, I'd just like to ask Elizabeth if there are any live questions that have been asked during the webinar so far that we might want to address now.
Hi, Brock. Yes, actually, one just came in, so that's fantastic. And so I'll just, whatever panelist wants to answer this, but here's the question. Given that Medicine Hat has built housing for low-income people and saved more money in emergency services, et cetera, than previously spent, why can't this be done here? Anyone want to jump in and answer that?
I could take a first shot, Elizabeth, if that's
Great.
all right. It's Ryan.
Okay.
So yeah, great question. Medicine Hat was one of the first communities, if not the first in Canada, to declare an end to chronic homelessness. So obviously they've figured something out, right? They've also been the subject recently of a CBC document. If that's where the question is coming from, would also just put in a plug that it's worth a watch for those of you that haven't seen it. One of the differences between our model here and every other province and territory across the country is that locally, the housing and homelessness system is administered by the municipalities versus directly by the province. So there's some funding and inequities built into that model. Provinces are much more able and equipped to put in the funding and create unilateral policy that municipalities just don't have the ability or the tax base to do. That being said, I think that we have been putting forward the business case for a long time that absolutely it makes sense that for every dollar invested in housing, you will see 3 to 10-fold the savings on the other sides of the equation from things like the justice sector, the health sector, and so on. So we know that the business case is there. It's a matter of pulling together, I think, different funding and policy decisions to really focus on a housing first approach. And housing first is really what underpins that philosophy, of which Waterloo Region firmly believes in and is a housing first community. So there's pieces of it there, there's pieces that are missing, but ultimately I think the business case and the recipe are there for us to look at.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Ryan. That's fantastic. Before I turn it back to Brock, I just want to remind everyone, we have over 200 people on the phone, and I know you will have questions. So please use the Q&A function. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brock to introduce our next speaker.
That's great. Thank you. So I'd now like to introduce our final speaker for the afternoon, John Neufeld. John is the proud father of Micah and Michaela and grateful husband of Andrea. Since 2009, John has had the privilege of serving as the executive director of House of Friendship, a multi-service organization focused on housing, addictions treatment, food security, and neighborhood development. Prior to serving at House of Friendship, John had the incredible opportunity of working with foster children and youth at Bridgeway Family Homes for 11 years. In his volunteering, John is involved with some boards and is an active member of the Sterling Avenue Mennonite Church. John enjoys traveling with family, spending time with friends, movies, reading business and fiction, squash, and technology. John, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time for this and to make affordable housing a priority in your thinking and in this community, and all of us coming together hopefully can build something together. I want you to imagine you playing your favorite sport, whether that's skiing, basketball, whatever you're doing. And if you can't picture yourself doing that, maybe picture Bruce Lochner playing soccer and he breaks both legs at the same time. And he's at the emergency department, or if you've had a skiing accident, you've got both legs broken. The doctor comes in, puts a cast on both your legs, and then says, go home, and walks out there. And you're sitting there and you're like, but how am I going to get to housing if I don't have a wheelchair, I don't have crutches, I don't have anyone to give me a ride? And for me, this is what the COVID period has really brought to the surface in some of our thinking and what we've discovered and observed for affordable housing. As Ryan said, we're a housing first community, which is fantastic, which means that we try to house people as quickly as we can. We don't do the old style of thinking that says, hey, you've got to clean up your act and you will deserve housing. If we can get you housed, then you will have more capacity to address your other challenges, whether that be mental health or addictions, whatever other health issues you may have. But what we learned in COVID is something rather profound. And for those of you who probably have read, or maybe you haven't heard this story, at the beginning of COVID, our whole shelter system had to dramatically shift here in region of Waterloo. Our shelter did not have the appropriate distancing. We had people getting sick, and we were a fear of a breakout. And so we were very fortunate that a hotel opened up its doors. We were able to move our whole shelter in less than 24 hours into the hotel, where we still are. We've doubled our numbers. We were close to 100. Our partners, YW, moved all the gentlemen out of St. Mark's Church into the Kaufman YMCA. And so what was different, though, about this that we hadn't done before, sheltering used to be like, we'll provide you a bed, we'll provide you some food, and then we'll try to get you into affordable housing and hope everything works out. And that's a little bit like the doctor walking out with you with 2 legs broken and cast. And so what we've learned during this time, what has been transformational in our community, is that while individuals are in shelter, we've provided them healthcare and access to a greater amount of services. And what we have found is that people are far more ready to move into housing, but also probably a much greater rate of success for housing. You simply can't take someone who's chronically homeless, and even if we actually did have enough stock of affordable housing, just throw them into the affordable housing and just kind of hope for the best. And I think what we've learned is that if we actually want affordable housing to be successful, yes, we need to build more stock and more available. But if we can do a few things initially and set people up for success, give them a bit more care, that will be success. So I'll just read from the words of one of the participants living in the hotel who wrote to us and said, "I feel like for the first time in a long time, I'm ready to tackle my addiction. Because of the conditions at the Radisson, I've been able to see a healthcare provider for the first time in over 5 years. I'm sleeping, really sleeping. I'm starting to feel like me. Thanks to the Radisson team, I've realized that I can live a life worth living and that I can do this." So for me, I just want to broaden out the discussion on affordable housing. It's not just simply increasing stock, which we desperately need, don't get me wrong, but I think we can also look at creative options for how we increase affordable housing. But how do we set people up for success to transition has been some of the learning we've done through COVID. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. So now we're going to open up the panel discussion portion. I'll ask the rest of the speakers to please join us again by video. A lot of this conversation is being guided by the questions that many of you submitted ahead of time. And thank you again to those that sent them. I'm also seeing there's questions coming through on the chat, and I know there's some coming through in the Q&A as well, and Elizabeth will come to some of those. But let's start with some of the ones that were sent ahead of time. So, Martine, I will first ask this question to you. In the past, affordable housing has often been low quality housing. Is there room to allow the private market to build lower quality housing? For example, smaller apartments with fewer bathrooms. And how low should it go?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that affordable housing should be of high quality. We want as high quality, safe, accessible housing for everybody, regardless of their income level and what they can pay. But it is an interesting question, and I'm not quite sure exactly what the person who posted is getting at. I think it's interesting to suggest that affordable housing has typically been low quality. I would challenge that a bit. I think that I know that there was pressure historically by the real estate lobby to try to keep costs for social housing down. So the government chose to do that for political reasons so that social housing didn't compete with the private sector. So there is like less frills, for example, in social housing. However, I would say that social housing has provided decent, high quality housing for people who need it historically in Canada. So I really challenge that kind of assumption there. But I also think that the question here is sort of asking, okay, how can we get the private sector to build affordable housing? Perhaps we should lower standards and then they will do it. But I'm not sure I agree with this direction of thinking. You have building codes and standards that were developed to make sure that all people had safe housing, light, air, space. I don't think we want to start thinking about having a two-tiered system for the poor. And if we want to see housing with lower quality standards, I mean, you can look all across the global south. there's lots of slum housing and informal housing. People make the most of it, but I don't think that's necessarily the policy direction that we want to go in. So I would say, ultimately, if we want to find solutions, we probably don't need to try to think about how do we throw more and more carrots at the private sector, subsidies, reductions in standards. They've had about 30 years since the federal government stepped away from this to innovate solutions for providing affordable housing. Haven't seen a lot get built. I think it's an experiment that we've really tested for a bit too long, and the way to do it is to actually have a lot more public support for social, nonprofit, affordable housing, and society pushing that and people asking for it. And it's really a question of political will in this nation where we have so many resources.
That's great. Ryan or John, I think you probably have local examples where the quality of affordable housing or supportive housing is actually quite amazing. And so wondering if you could share a couple of examples. I'm thinking of Inwell as an example.
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, it's been interesting when we tour folks through our supportive housing, because a lot of people don't understand, what does affordable housing look like or supportive housing, and they walk through and they're like, wow, this is really clean. It's dignified. It's really nice. And so we have this expectation that providing supportive or affordable housing has to be of lower quality. And I would say it's the other way around. I think, we don't have to have lots of fancy stuff, but I think just to do the basics. And it is interesting, I look at some of the housing Menno Homes has built in our community and is currently building there on St. Peter's Church. It's going to be dignified. It's going to be nice space. It's going to be open. I think of Indwell, who's building at St. Mark's Lutheran Church right by Grand River Hospital. I mean, the vision there for that building can be done. It's innovative. A lot of the supportive housing projects these days are very environmentally friendly. They're progressive. From a design perspective, they can be part of the funky architecture. Like I think we, there's been lots of models of how it can be done really well.
Ryan, anything to add?
Yeah, most of it has been covered, and I would just say too, from the regional perspective, in some of the partnerships that we've had most recently in building affordable housing, it is above standard that's out there. So some of our recent partnerships with Maxwell, with Menno Homes, with Vibe Developments, like the type of housing that has been developed is top notch in every way. Right from environmental efficiencies to design concepts, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree with both John and Martine, and don't think the policy decision is to decrease standards. And I'm wondering if the question has to relate to more of some of the older social housing that we have in stock that was inherited from the province, 20 years ago at this point. It's not the type of housing that we would build today, but it has been maintained still to a quality standard overall. We're just some additional places that I would comment on.
That's great. John, someone asked specifically how the community has been helping people who are homeless during COVID-19 and what more we can do to help.
Yeah, so I already touched a little bit upon what we've done with folks who are chronically homeless, who are on our street in the shelter system. And so public health mandated that we have to have people sheltered in place. So we not only provided a bed overnight, but we had to kind of have a place for them all day long. And so so usually in the shelter system, often what will happen is people have to leave for the day and then come back at night or whatever. But here people were able to stay, get really good food, get good sleep, address all their needs. And most importantly, they were also able to address their health issues because right in the hotel, we actually had a medical floor, we had doctors, interns. And so because of that, we actually housed quite a few people, and Ryan can give maybe the specific stats, but I was astounded by how many people we actually moved from the street into housing right during COVID. But also because of these extra supports, because people weren't kind of moving all around, they were actually had a stable place just to stay 24/7. We're getting a lot of their other needs met. We were able to house quite a few people during this time.
And just to pick up on that comment, John, absolutely. When I looked at the stats just this week in terms of number of chronically homeless people that we housed through the months of April and May. So right when COVID was sort of at its peak, we housed 44 chronically homeless individuals during that time, which really speaks to some of the excellent work that happened during a really challenging time. So we didn't lose focus. We continued to keep up and continue to do some really fantastic community work to get people housed through that period.
It's I think this kind of ties into this topic around COVID-19 specifically, and I guess the question here is, has COVID-19 shed a more positive light on the affordable housing needs in Waterloo Region? And if so, might social impact investing accelerate the development of new projects? What groups might play a leading role in financing new projects? And Ryan, perhaps you can answer and talk a little bit more about the Housing Innovation Roundtable.
Yeah, for sure, Brock, and that's where my mind was going with that question. It's one of the items on that table's agenda. So the Housing Innovation Roundtable is a new table that got started earlier this year, and really wanting to pull people together from different sectors to tackle the affordable housing issue. So we've got people from the municipal sector, we've got people from the charitable sector, we've got people from the private sector in terms of developers, we've got academics and people from the tech sector, and on and on. So it was specific in targeting groups that had an interest or a value add in contribution to tackling this issue, and pooling resources and thoughts together in a cohesive way, cohesive and coordinated way to really come at innovative approaches to this. So the social impact investing is a great question. I think that there's lots of opportunity there. It's about pooling resources and putting them together in a way that will have the most impact on the issue overall. And it's definitely a topic that the Housing Innovation Roundtable is currently wrestling with.
Martine, perhaps you can answer this next one. How can we ensure that accessibility is being considered when planning affordable new housing? And what new affordable housing opportunities, if any, do you foresee in Waterloo Region post-COVID-19?
Yeah, I really wish that one of the students in our program at the School of Planning was here, Amanda McCulley. She's actually doing her master's research on housing for people with disabilities in the region of Waterloo. And so when she's finished with that, she's going to have great recommendations. So stay tuned. I myself am not an expert. What I have learned from Amanda is that there are rules to have 15% of newly built units in multifamily must be accessible, barrier-free units. However, what she's found is that that's not quite enough, and it's constrained only to multifamily. So that sort of limits the type of housing form newly being built as a requirement for people with disabilities. And also there's no guarantee that it's going to be affordable. So among some of the things that she recommends is that we need to recognize people with disabilities as a priority in housing plans uniquely. Of course, to increase supports for the development of accessible housing, and then really importantly, engage people with disabilities in designing these programs and housing, because everybody has different needs and preferences, which should be accounted for. But I know your question asks, like, how can we ensure that this happens? Another thing that you often find in plans is sort of maybe weaker language saying this is something that would be nice to have. If you want to ensure that you have more housing, accessible housing for people with disabilities, you could have stronger targets and maybe make these types of policies more enforceable so that the housing would get built.
That's great. Ryan, this is another question for you. How will the plan for affordable housing address the needs of the underhoused population in Cambridge, which remains a large proportion of the total number of underhoused people in Waterloo Region? And before you answer, it is worth noting that one of KWCF's first impact investments was with Housing Cambridge, who is building a 56-unit affordable housing building, including supports by Thresholds Homes and Supports, Independent Living Center, Ontario Disability Support Program, and Wigwamin Incorporated. So Ryan, do you want to say that question?
I think I got it, Brock, but please feel free to redirect me if I don't capture it appropriately. So, number one, at the region of Waterloo, obviously we look at a regional approach to affordable housing. What I will say is we've got one affordable housing build that's currently in rent-up status right now. That is a project that we undertook with 5 developments. And there's another one currently in development on Hespler Road. So by no means is City of Cambridge not being looked at in terms of how the region moves affordable housing initiatives and projects forward. And I guess what I would say in terms of our overall approach and our strategy, really how we have strategized what it is that we're doing and where we are putting resources is all available through our 10-year housing and homelessness plan. So this is our land map of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and when we're doing it. So this is the strategic document that we follow that was developed with a significant community consultation about actions that we should be undertaking region-wide as they pertain to affordable housing and homelessness and everything in between along that housing continuum. So just a couple of projects that for sure are underway in Cambridge. There's also a few other things in the works that I'm not at liberty to talk about it in detail, but what I will say is there's a real creative pilot project that's going to be on its way for the City of Cambridge that'll be public very shortly as well. So a few ways that we're moving the needle in the City of Cambridge, but also that we look at affordable housing and homelessness from a regional lens too.
That's great. John, for people who require support or supports in addition to affordable housing, can you tell us a little bit what it looks like for people? How do they navigate it? Oh, you muted.
Yeah, thanks, Brock. We can always, this is the trick of affordable housing, is just putting a roof over someone's head isn't the answer. It's a beginning step. But for a lot of the individuals we serve, profound mental health, addiction, trauma issues, lots of challenges. And so the real magic of affordable and supportive housing is getting access to supports, and whether that's on site right in the building, getting the support from the staff in the building, or partnering with so many of our community partners who then provide, whether it's health support, medical support, food, different. So it has to be a joint effort to really make housing successful beyond just putting a roof over someone's head.
And Ryan, question for you. Are there subsidies for homeowners who want to create affordable housing rental units? And what are the cities and region doing to fast track alternative housing options?
Thanks, Brock. So a few pieces there. I just wanted to tag on to John's last response around supportive housing and tie that back to something I said earlier in terms of housing first, right? So housing isn't just about housing people, it's about housing them appropriately and putting the proper supports in place to ensure that they're successful in that housing journey. So the two work hand in hand and are absolutely necessary in a successful housing first community. So did want to just add that on. So the question around housing subsidies. So was this about rental, Brock? I missed that part, or was this about home ownership?
Yeah, it's about homeowners that want to create affordable housing rental units and the subsidies that are available to them, or are there other fast track alternative housing options?
Yes, so I'll speak high level around the homeowners and programs to develop rental units. So the region of Waterloo operates a program called Ontario Renovates. And one of the programs under the Ontario Renovates umbrella, which is a provincial program that we administer, is the ability to support creation of secondary suites. So you can access this program, you can access funding to renovate a basement, or a granny flat or something on your existing property to create an affordable rental unit. So there's lots of information on the region's website about the details of that program. But in short, absolutely, there is a program that's available for homeowners to create secondary suites for the purposes of affordable rental. So would encourage folks to have a look at the Region of Waterloo website under the Housing Services section. And you'll find all kinds of detail, not only about this program, but other things that the Ontario Renovates program can offer. It can offer subsidies to help people renovate their house in order to keep it. So rather than lose it because your mobility needs have changed, you can access this to put a ramp or make it otherwise accessible. If your furnace has failed and you're in danger of losing your home and not having heat, you could access a fund like this to help you stay in your house if you're challenged by affordability issues. So it's a great program, and in the essence of time, would direct people to our website to see the details.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to go a little off script, go and have a heart attack. Okay, so there's a comment in the chat that I think is interesting as it relates to then my last question for you. So it says, it is highly unfortunate that it took a pandemic to realize that consistent extra supports and a safe place to be all day and night is what effectively prepares people to maintain housing. Given the success of this model, will it be continuously maintained and municipally supported going forward? And I think in reading that, my one comment on it is, I think we realized it before COVID. I think what COVID did was create an extraordinary moment and set of constraints that forced us to do things differently in a way that we never could have before. It broke everything. And it allowed us to put some things back together differently, and they just didn't have the opportunity before. That Radisson wasn't empty. And so that was not an option, and suddenly it became an option. So I think there is something about being in an extraordinary moment, and how do we continue to be extraordinary? What are the extraordinary things we should be fighting for and pushing for right now that would really make a significant difference related to this issue? So all three of you are welcome to answer that. I'd love to hear from all three of you on that. So who would like to dive in?
Brock, I'll just dive in because it also ties in with the last question you were supposed to ask us. What are the big audacious steps we need to take? So I just want to throw a challenge to all the participants on the call. A couple of things that I'd like us to think about as a community. Number one, I think we, through COVID, we realized we have to transform the way we provide shelter in this community. So if you haven't gone to sheltercare.ca, I would encourage people to do that. I think we have to integrate healthcare and shelter to better prepare people for success in housing. Number two, I would say, let's get more creative with affordable housing. You can do some really imaginative things. It doesn't have to be just, the old thing is build a building over there, find some land, build a high rise, and just put people on low income into the building. What if we did some of the kind of stuff, like if I think of the Perkins Center in Hamilton, where you've got smaller units of housing, but in the basement, you've got McMaster School of University. What if here in Waterloo Region, we had supportive and affordable housing where, we had a few floors of maybe tech companies were on a couple of floors. We had the faculty of nursing, social work, whatever faculty of some social service faculty or something that was helping related on another floor, and then 3 or 4 floors of housing. And those people would be colliding every day on the elevator and learning from each other. Why do we have to do these like separate buildings? So just a little bit of reimagination of what supportive housing could look like and what it could all accomplish. Number 3, I think we need to support, there was a question in the chat room, what about Lot 42? What's going on there? We need to support innovative ideas and where we try different things, right? It might fail, it might not, but we've got incubators throughout Waterloo Region for the tech sector. We need incubators for our field. We need incubators for affordable housing. We need to try different things. We need to be able to fail. We need to do that. And sort of to that end, I think we're starting to see this. We're getting on the cusp of this in Waterloo Region, is the massive role faith communities and maybe other sectors in the community can play, but there's a lot of land that faith communities are sitting on. Some of those faith communities are changing. And so, you know, I'm so excited to see, again, the project by Mental Homes at St. Peter's, by Indwell at St. Mark's, you know, reimagining the spaces that we have and what could they do to play a role. So just some of the things I want to throw out for people's imagination and helping us move forward here in Waterloo Region with affordable housing.
It's my turn.
Sure.
Yeah, I really love this question from Ileana about, you know, why did it take a pandemic for us to realize this? I think that, I mean, one of the functions of like a bare bones punitive welfare state is to terrify people into being in the low wage employment market, right? And to create this society in which we think, okay, I don't want to be one of those people that gets stuck on the street. I'll work as hard as I can to avoid that, without recognizing that, you know, this is it's a systemic impact of the system that we have. So we're trying to work within it rather than challenge that system. And I think that what's happening with the pandemic is we have been implementing responses to inequality, to social inequality, and seeing social inequality be laid bare in new ways. And people are kind of they've had enough with it in a way. And so I think this is the very exciting thing, the exciting potential that the pandemic brings, is this new collective sense that we can have different goals for our society. And maybe we don't have to go back to a system in which after the pandemic ends, all the people that have been temporarily housed in hotels in cities around the world who are responding in these types of ways, that they're just going to go back on the streets. I think that would seem in this moment to be unacceptable. And so why was it acceptable before? And I hope it isn't acceptable in the future. So in terms of big changes that we could have, I mean, I don't think that it's audacious, although it might seem audacious in the political moment, which maybe is changing. But I think, sorry, it's loud in here. I think that investing resources in these types of things, affordable housing, other types of social supports, education, defunding police. We're hearing these calls so much from people who have experienced violence at the hand of the police, and redistributing these resources so that we can create a better, more equitable society.
And just to chime in as the third panelist on it, and yeah, great comments that we've been asked to respond to. I think as I think about like my opening remarks, this comment is getting at exactly, you know, what I was saying. To build on what Martine and John have said at this point, hey, in every crisis there is opportunity, and shame on us if we don't take this opportunity to build back better. So here is our chance. We are at a municipal level rapidly putting together a plan that we want to see this system function better, more appropriately, and have more capacity overall to meet the needs that is out there across this region. And again, to go back to my opening comments, I think that is truly the mark of a successful and healthy community. If we can do that and take care of the most vulnerable of us, then we are truly being successful, and we've got opportunity to do that. And I really hope that we don't miss it, and that higher orders of government are also recognizing this, that now is the time to change what has always been the case. So that's all that I would add.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth, who has been monitoring the Q&A, just to share any live questions with the panelists.
That's great. Thanks, Brock. And ask and ye shall receive. We've got lots of questions in there, probably not enough time in the 8 minutes we have left, but I'm going to try to get off a few of these. So one that's been getting a lot of attention is this question: how might Waterloo Region tackle NIMBY, not in my backyard, and frustration from neighbors who don't want people who are low income, managing addictions, or chronically homeless living next door? How can shelters, supportive housing, and affordable housing projects be given priority for land and resources in this community and in our cities. Anyone want to jump in on the NIMBY question?
I can start, I think, because it's certainly one that that resonates with me, and it is sort of the great irony of my role as director of housing. This demand for affordable housing, and every time you move a project forward, it is met with incredible opposition in the community, and trying to navigate all of that is can be challenging and frustrating. So really, how do we do that? I think it takes a whole lot of education. It takes a whole lot of patience and conversation, and having people understanding the true depth of the issue. And at the end of the day, it takes like really some seriousness in just saying, okay, we've heard you, but ultimately this project needs to proceed because the need for affordable housing is greater in our community. There's ways to actively involve a community in terms of engagement and having them contribute to things like the design, the structure, things of that nature that can help incorporate a project into a neighborhood. But ultimately, we need to have people on board and supporting affordable housing and other innovative projects in our community if we're truly going to be successful in this. I know that there has been movement across the region in terms of a yes in my backyard campaign, and switching the narrative to that perspective, which again is about communication, is about framing, is about listening and understanding, but ultimately moving ahead with affordable housing or other projects at the end of the day, understanding that that's the greater need in our community.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Martine or John, you want to jump in before we move to the next question?
Maybe I'll just respond really quickly. I mean, it's a great question. How do you change people's attitudes? How do you reduce exclusionary attitudes and behaviors? I mean, I don't have a lot of sympathy for those attitudes, and I really think that we just need to fight back against that really strong and say, you know what, too bad, tough luck. Members of our community, regardless of who they are, ought to have the right to live anywhere. And this idea of I'm going to, you know, hunker down and protect my property and keep out those people, whoever those people happens to be, I think that's got to be in the past. And it can't be based on this hope that everybody will suddenly have a change of heart. There's actually a role for planning here. If we had maybe zoning codes that were more expansive and included certain types of housing as of right, higher density housing, group homes, shelters, and these types of things, then you wouldn't have that, you wouldn't be triggering that opportunity for local communities to fight against it. You wouldn't be triggering that pressure on the council people to try to have to deal with those really powerful, loud voices of the people who have more money and more privilege and want to keep people out and protect that privilege. So I think that for once, you know, as a planning professor, it's nice to see that I think there is an interesting role for planning here to create more inclusionary communities. And I'll quickly add, if you do increase allowable density, for example, in a community, you need to also have strong rent controls to ensure that that doesn't push up property values and prices, and then generate gentrification, which ends up displacing people again.
Great, thanks, Martine. I'm going to move on to one of the next questions. How do we get the giant corporations out of buying up all the spaces and driving them for profit gain? Is it in policy only? And who would be responsible for enforcing it or reviewing the purchases? So, Ryan, perhaps? Martine? John?
I'll take a shot, and I'll probably just use an example as part of my answer. So recently garnered a fair bit of media attention. Property in city of Waterloo, the Civitan building was put up for sale. With some community effort, with some municipal investment from both the city and the region, a group came together through Supportive Housing of Waterloo and were able to purchase that building in order to preserve it as affordable housing, as one example. What that took was like a whole lot of work and partnership and willingness to, one, make that happen, But also on the other hand, you needed an ownership group that was also willing to entertain that. So there's one example about how we made something work. That's not an answer overall in terms of like the policy or what may or may not be able to be accomplished through that realm. And that's a bit out of my depth, but maybe I would just start the answer of what I think has been quite a successful process overall in a way to preserve affordable units and not just see them be sold to the highest bidder and have rents increased and on in that cycle.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to leave us with one last question here, and it's about bringing in investors. So my experience has been, this individual says, my experience has been that there isn't anyone willing to pay to develop the business case, financial, economic modeling, risk analysis, structuring the deal, etc. We will not be able to attract investors until this work is done. Thoughts? And it started off with saying, Ryan, I agree with you that we know there is a business case for making housing first, but we actually need to develop the business case that will allow us to bring in investors. So thoughts on investors, whether it be around getting the business case or even like impact investing like we do at the Community Foundation.
So I'm wondering if, I mean, that's where part of my thinking was with one of the creative pieces was of the whole building isn't just supportive housing. Now, from a social impact, I think we have, people living in supportive housing integrated more in the community and interacting with others. But there is a business case to it too, right? I mean, you would have market rate businesses paying that on some of the floors, which would probably make the business case a little bit more palatable than if you came to ask someone to build, a 9-story affordable housing where, people have no money to buy into the units and everything would have to be paid somehow by the community or government. So I think trying to figure out from a business perspective, how can we create more sustainable models of supportive housing moving forward might be also more enticing to the business community.
Thanks, John. All right, it's 2 o'clock on the button. There are many questions that we did not get to. You will have our commitment that when we send out a recording of this, we will answer as many of those as we can and send the Q&A attached when we send the link to the video out. So a huge thank you again to Martine and Ryan and John for sharing your expertise today, for Brock for moderating a very interesting panel on this topic.